It wasn't love that brought Rose down the aisle. It was a contract. A deal with a man whose kiss would be for the cameras. And whose heart still belonged to someone else. It's story time again in K-Folk Hub. Sit tight, relax and grab a popcorn. Please don't forget to like, comment, share and subscribe to our channel after. It's totally free. Now let us begin. The first sound Rose heard that evening was the rain. Not the hesitant drizzle of a passing cloud, but the deliberate, almost theatrical downpour that seemed determined to leave an impression. It fell in unbroken sheets over Seoul, turning the sharp lines of skyscrapers into blurred silhouettes, as if someone had smudged the city with a wet brush. Neon lights from street signs and billboards bled into the puddles like oil paintings left out in the storm. From the tall arched windows of the Jun family's great hall, the view was alive, grey skies rolling low, glass towers slit with water, and a slow-moving trail of headlights weaving through the streets below. The city seemed restless. So did she. Inside, the air was warm and saturated with the mingled scents of imported lilies, polished wood, and the faint tang of rain that drifted in whenever the grand doors opened. Gold chandeliers glowed above, scattering their light over marble floors polished to a mirrored sheen. Guests, Seoul's elite, dressed in silks and tailored suits, murmured among themselves, voices low but not low enough to hide the undercurrent of curiosity. She stood at the far end of the aisle, a vision in ivory. Her gown flowed around her like liquid pearl, its fitted bodice melting into a long train that whispered across the floor. Under her veil, her face was composed, every movement rehearsed for grace. But her eyes betrayed the weight of a woman walking toward a future she did not choose entirely for herself. The whispers carried easily. She didn't need to understand the language, tone alone told the story. She's from Africa, a Nigerian actress. Why her? Siojene was the perfect wife. Is this just to make her jealous? Rose had been an actress long enough to recognize an audience. These people were watching not out of love for her but to see what would unfold, whether the scandal would be worth the ticket. At the altar, Jun-Lee waited. The man was as much an emblem of control as he was of wealth, tall, immaculately dressed in a charcoal suit whose stitching alone probably cost more than her first film paycheck. His face was sharp, his gaze direct yet distant, like a man who knew exactly where he stood in the world and how to remain untouched by it. When their hands met, his was warm, steady, but impersonal. The touch said, "We have an arrangement." The officiant spoke, his voice a measured cadence in Korean. The vows came next, each word pronounced with the precision of tradition. Rose repeated hers carefully, aware of the weight in every syllable, even if the meaning, in that moment, felt like a script she had been given rather than lines she had chosen. When the kiss came, it was brief, ceremonial. Enough to satisfy the guests, not enough to cross the threshold into something real. The applause was polite, not exuberant. Outside, the rain continued, beating against the glass as if trying to get in. And so, Rose Oji became Mrs. Jun-Lee. The reception glittered. Tables draped in white silk were set with crystal glasses and gold-trimmed plates. Musicians played soft jazz near the stage, their notes floating under the polite hum of conversation. Waiters moved like shadows between tables, serving champagne and dishes that looked like works of art. Rose sat beside Jun-Lee at the head table, smiling when spoken to, nodding when addressed. The cameras caught everything, the way his hand rested near hers without touching, the way she leaned slightly toward him when guests approached, the picture of a harmonious couple. But harmony was an illusion. She had known from the beginning that this marriage was not born of love. He had been honest, brutally so, the day he proposed. They had met at a charity gala 2 months earlier. She had been in Seoul filming a Korean-Nigerian co-production when her director introduced her to the city's most influential guests. Jun-Lee had been there, standing apart from the crowd, his suit immaculate, his watch a glint of understated luxury. They had exchanged only a few words before his assistant approached her days later with a request for a private meeting. That meeting had changed everything. He told her he needed a wife. Not for love. Not for companionship. But for optics, to provoke the woman who had walked out of his life 3 years earlier. The proposal was businesslike. She would gain financial stability, he would gain the public image he wanted. She could continue her career, he would not interfere. It was madness. She had laughed at first, thinking it a joke. But then, the offer came with numbers, contracts, and the kind of security she had never truly known. Rose was an orphan. Raised by relatives who saw her more as a burden than family, she had built her life from nothing. Acting had been her escape, her salvation, but it was also unstable. A contract like this meant she could secure her future, help the few friends she trusted, and perhaps she could make him love her. So she had said yes. That night at the reception, she caught his gaze for the briefest moment. There was no warmth in it, but there was something else. A shadow. And that was when she saw her. Siojene. She stood near the far column, her gown black, her hair in a sleek knot. She was the kind of beautiful that made people stare without realizing it, her posture effortless, her smile faint and unreadable. Their eyes met across the room, and in that single moment, Rose understood. This was the ghost haunting her marriage. The first time Rose saw Siojene's smile, it felt like a blade wrapped in silk. It was the kind of smile that didn't belong to the present moment, but to a private memory only the smiler could see. Siojene's eyes barely shifted toward Rose, yet Rose could feel the weight of her scrutiny. She moved like someone who owned her place in the world, her heels clicking softly against marble, her perfume carrying a faint, cold note of jasmine. When she approached Jun-Lee, his posture altered, subtly, but enough for Rose to see it. The man who never let his mask slip allowed the smallest flicker of something, familiarity, regret, maybe longing. Rose turned to sip her champagne, wheeling her face into the same calm composure she used during press conferences. She had played queens and heiresses before, surely she could manage a bride who wasn't threatened. But the truth was sharper. Her hands, hidden under the table, tightened around the stem of her glass until her knuckles whitened. The conversation between Jun-Lee and Siojene was short, polite. Still, Rose caught the way Siojene's eyes lingered on his ring finger before she glanced, almost lazily, toward Rose. When the woman finally left, Rose felt the shift in the air, like a room slowly exhaling. "She's beautiful," Rose said lightly, careful to keep her tone without accusation. Jun-Lee's eyes flicked toward her. "She's just a guest." But just a guest didn't carry that much silence after it. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of speeches, photos, and the slow, dragging awareness that everyone here knew more about her husband's past than she did. By the time the last guest departed, Rose's smile felt carved into place. They rode home in silence. Seoul streets gleamed under the rain, each red traffic light reflected in the wet asphalt like a wound. Jun-Lee sat beside her in the back seat, his phone resting idle in his hand, his gaze fixed somewhere beyond the glass. At their penthouse, a space so modern and vast it felt more like a high-end gallery than a home, he walked ahead, loosening his tie. Rose paused in the doorway, taking in the panoramic view of the city from the floor-to-ceiling windows. Somewhere out there was the version of her life she had imagined as a child, and yet she was here, wrapped in silk, feeling like a supporting character in someone else's story. That night, they did not share a bed. He disappeared into his study, and when she woke in the morning, his side of the bed was untouched. It was on the third day that Rose met Jun-Lee. She was a small thing, 9 years old, with straight black hair and the same sharp, intelligent eyes as her father. She arrived at the penthouse escorted by a nanny, her school bag slung over one shoulder, her expression wary. "This is Rose," Jun-Lee said, standing in the living room. "She's your stepmother now." The word landed in the space between them like a heavy coin dropped into still water. Jun-Lee looked at her for a long moment, then gave a small bow, polite, but distant. Rose crouched so they were eye level. "Hello, Jun-Lee. You can call me Rose if you like." The girl didn't answer, only nodded before walking past her toward her room. Jun-Lee's gaze followed his daughter until the door clicked shut. "She's cautious," he said, almost apologetically. Rose forced a small smile. "She's just a child. She'll warm up eventually." But deep down, she knew that eventually was not promised. The days that followed were slow, marked by polite exchanges over breakfast and long hours alone while Jun-Lee worked. Rose filled her time with script readings, calls to her manager, and exploring the city with her driver. Yet no matter where she went, whispers trailed her, on social media, in tabloids, in the subtle pauses of strangers who recognized her face. And always, Siojene's name lingered in those whispers. It happened at a charity dinner 2 weeks later. The ballroom was drenched in gold light, the air thick with the scent of roses and the hum of polite networking. Rose wore a sapphire gown that clung to her in all the right places, her hair swept into a soft chignon. Jun-Lee, in black tie, was the picture of stoic elegance. Halfway through the evening, she saw Siojene again. This time, Siojene approached her directly. "Mrs. Jun-Lee," she said in perfect English, her voice smooth as cream. "I've been meaning to properly congratulate you." Rose smiled. "That's kind of you." Siojene's eyes flickered briefly toward Jun-Lee, then back. "It must be quite an adjustment, marrying into such a visible life." "It has its challenges," Rose replied, keeping her tone even. "I imagine so." Siojene's smile widened slightly, but her gaze was a challenge, a subtle, unspoken "you're temporary." Later that night, when they returned home, Rose asked the question that had been burning in her chest since the wedding. "Do you still love her?" Jun-Lee froze, his tie half untied. "This marriage was never about love, Rose. You knew that." "That's not what I asked." His silence was answer enough. Rain swept across Seoul that night, turning the city into a moving painting of blurred lights and shadowed corners. The penthouse windows shivered faintly against the wind, but inside, everything was too still. Rose sat on the velvet sofa, her bare feet tucked under her, the television glowing in front of her with a movie she wasn't watching. Her thoughts kept circling back to the way Jun-Lee had looked at her before retreating into silence, like she had trespassed on a locked room in his mind. She had not married for love either, at least, that's what she had told herself, but she had believed that, in time, they might find it somewhere between the convenience and the contract. Now she wasn't so sure. When the elevator chimed an hour later, she thought it might be him coming back from wherever he had gone to escape their conversation. Instead, it was Jun-Lee, small and quiet in her school uniform, clutching a damp umbrella. The nanny hovered behind her. "She wanted to see you," the woman said softly before retreating. Rose blinked. "It's late. Is everything alright?" Jun-Lee hesitated, then padded into the living room. She didn't sit. She simply stood there, eyes darting to the rain outside. "Appa doesn't like storms," she said finally. Rose tilted her head. "No. He says they make him remember things." "What kind of things?" The girl shrugged, but the faintest crease appeared between her brows. "Bad ones." Before Rose could ask more, Jun-Lee turned and disappeared into the guest hallway, leaving only the faint scent of rainwater and the echo of a truth Rose wasn't ready to understand. The first time she saw him, he was leaning casually against a black SUV parked outside the studio where she was shooting a commercial. He was tall, with a frame that suggested quiet strength, his dark skin and sharp features standing out against the pale backdrop of the city. His eyes followed her, but not in the way a fan's would. His gaze was protective, almost calculating. When she stepped out of the building, he moved forward. "Rose." Her brows drew together. "Do I know you?" "You do. Just, not here." His voice was deep, resonant, carrying the kind of authority that made people instinctively lower their own. She crossed her arms. "Who are you?" "I'm Kcee. Your uncle sent me." Her stomach tightened. She hadn't spoken to her mother's older brother in years, not since a family disagreement that had scattered them like seeds in the wind. "Why?" "To watch your back." "Because the man you married," he paused, studying her face, "isn't the only one with an agenda." That night, she replayed the meeting in her head while sitting at her dressing table. The idea of having a shadow, someone silently guarding her, felt both reassuring and unsettling. She didn't tell Jun-Lee. Something told her that Kcee's presence was better kept as her own secret. The weeks turned into a delicate dance of appearances. Rose attended public events with Jun-Lee, their hands linked just long enough for the cameras to catch the shot. In private, their interactions were polite, transactional. But something shifted the night they hosted a small dinner for investors at the penthouse. Siojene was there again, in red this time, her hair swept over one shoulder, her smile warm enough to melt glass. She laughed at Jun-Lee's remarks in a way that seemed practiced, proprietary. Rose kept her own expression serene, pouring wine into crystal glasses, responding graciously to every question directed at her. But when she caught Jun-Lee watching Siojene as she left the room, something in her chest went cold. Later, after the guests were gone and the staff had cleared the table, she found him in the study, staring at the skyline. "You look at her like you remember a different life," Rose said quietly. He didn't deny it. "Then why marry me?" His answer came after a long pause. Because you're the only person she can't control. The words sat between them, heavy and strange. She wanted to ask what he meant, but part of her feared the answer. From that night on, Rose began to see the invisible lines running through their world, alliances, grudges, debts. Siojene wasn't just an ex-wife, she was woven into the very fabric of the company, her family's influence touching everything from contracts to board decisions. Jun-Lee's marriage to Rose wasn't just about making Siojene jealous. It was about cutting through her hold on him without declaring war. And somewhere in the shadows, Kcee watched, his presence now a quiet rhythm in her life. Sometimes she would catch sight of him across the street when she left the building. Sometimes he would send her a brief, untraceable message, "Be careful tonight." She never asked how he knew what he knew. Then came the night of the charity auction. The ballroom glittered with chandeliers and gold accents, every guest draped in wealth. Rose wore a deep emerald gown, her hair falling in loose waves. Jun-Lee, in his midnight black suit, looked like the kind of man empires were built for. Midway through the evening, an item came up for bid, a painting Rose recognized. It had hung in her grandmother's sitting room for years before being sold during a financial downturn. She glanced at Jun-Lee, who gave the slightest nod. Within minutes, the painting was hers again. But when she turned to thank him, he wasn't looking at her. He was watching Siojene, whose smile had slipped for just a moment. And Rose understood, this wasn't about sentiment. It was about leverage. The rain had stopped by the next morning, leaving the city washed clean, the air sharp with the scent of wet stone. From the penthouse balcony, the Han River shimmered in the pale light of dawn. Rose stood there, wrapped in a silk robe, a cup of green tea cooling in her hands. The painting from the auction leaned against the far wall inside, still waiting for a place on the wall. It should have been a happy sight, a piece of her history returned. But Jun-Lee's absence gnawed at her. He had left early, saying something about a board meeting. She had nodded, pretending not to notice the hesitation in his voice. But deep down, she knew when a man was hiding something. By mid-afternoon, she found herself restless. The studio had called to cancel her shoot, and the silence of the penthouse felt heavier than usual. She slipped on a pair of sunglasses and left, telling the concierge she would be gone a few hours. Seoul streets were alive with color and noise, the scent of roasting chestnuts from a street cart, the melodic chatter of shopkeepers, the hum of traffic rolling past. She wandered aimlessly, her heels clicking against the wet pavement, until she reached the glass-fronted lobby of the Han Group's headquarters. She had not planned to come here. But her feet had a way of making decisions her mind had not yet caught up to. Inside, the marble gleamed under the recessed lighting. Executives in tailored suits moved briskly through the space, eyes fixed on unseen destinations. Rose ignored the receptionist's polite inquiry and made her way toward the elevators. When the doors opened on the 32nd floor, she stepped into a hushed corridor lined with frosted glass offices. From the far end came a laugh, low, familiar, intimate. She followed it. Through the half-open door, she saw Jun-Lee. His jacket was off, his sleeves rolled, his posture relaxed in a way she rarely saw at home. Across from him sat Siojene, her legs crossed, her body angled toward him like a secret. Between them on the desk lay a folder, but neither of them seemed to be looking at it. Rose couldn't hear the words, but she didn't need to. The look in Siojene's eyes, and the way Jun-Lee's lips curved in answer, said enough. She stood there for one heartbeat too long. Siojene's gaze shifted, catching her reflection in the glass. That smile, slow, deliberate, poisonous, spread across her face like ink. Rose turned without a word, the air in her lungs suddenly too thin. The elevator ride down felt endless. Outside, the city lights were just beginning to stir awake, but she no longer noticed the glow. She walked for blocks without direction, until the crowd thinned and the streets grew quieter. That was when she heard it, a low voice behind her. "You saw something you weren't meant to." She spun. Kcee stepped out from the shadow of a narrow alley, hands in the pockets of his leather jacket. "You've been following me?" she demanded. "Always." His gaze was steady. "And now you understand why I'm here." The rest of his words were lost in the roar of a passing bus. But she caught the most important part. "You're not safe here anymore." The evening had a strange heaviness to it, as though the city itself had leaned in to listen. Neon signs blinked to life above narrow streets, their light trembling across puddles left by the morning rain. Somewhere in the distance, a saxophone played, not the sweet kind of jazz, but the restless, searching kind. Rose and Kcee stood beneath the overhang of a closed bookstore. She could still feel the cold bite of the moment in Jun-Lee's office, the way Siojene's eyes had held hers, not in shame but in triumph. "You think I'm overreacting," Kcee said, his voice low, "but I've been watching this man since the day you said yes to him." She shook her head, more in defense than disagreement. "You don't know him like I do." "I know enough," Kcee replied. "I know the way men move when they're hiding something." "And Jun-Lee," he stepped closer, his breath a mix of coffee and rain. "Jun-Lee is hiding more than one thing." They began walking. The streets grew narrower, older, lined with crumbling brick walls and overgrown vines. Rose was aware of their footsteps echoing in the near-empty lane, the faint hum of electricity from the wires overhead. "I didn't ask you to follow me," she said finally. "I don't need your permission to keep you alive." The words sat between them, heavier than the air. By the time she returned to the penthouse, Jun-Lee was home. He was standing by the floor-to-ceiling window, glass in hand, the city stretching endlessly beneath him. "You left without telling me," he said, not turning around. "I didn't know I needed to," she answered. Silence. When he did face her, his eyes searched hers in a way that made her pulse stutter. But then, just as quickly, his expression shuttered, replaced with that polite coolness she hated. "Dinner's in the kitchen," he said. And just like that, the conversation was over. Later that night, she couldn't sleep. She stood barefoot on the balcony, the wind pulling at her robe. Somewhere in the city, Siojene was probably sipping wine in some designer lounge, wearing that same smile she'd worn in the office. Rose wrapped her arms around herself. She didn't hear the sound at first, the faint scrape, the almost imperceptible shuffle. But then she turned, and there he was again, coming from the hallway. She stepped back inside. "Jun-Lee." No answer. The scrape came again, closer this time. Her heart slammed against her ribs as she reached for the nearest thing she could use as a weapon, a heavy glass vase from the side table. A shadow slid across the wall. She raised the vase. And then, a hand reached out from the dark. The vase was cold and solid in her hands, the weight of it trembling with her pulse. "Rose." The voice stopped her mid-swing. Kcee stepped into the spill of moonlight from the balcony, his hands raised, his eyes scanning the room as though still expecting trouble. "What are you doing here?" she hissed, lowering the vase but not setting it down. "Your front door wasn't locked," he said, moving past her into the living area. "That's the first problem. The second is," he glanced toward the hallway. "You're being watched." Her stomach twisted. "By who?" He didn't answer. He moved like a man trained for this, checking the corners, glancing at the shadows cast by the tall furniture. "Kcee, you can't just break in." "I didn't break in. I came in." He finally looked at her, his expression grim. "And if I hadn't, you wouldn't have known someone's been lingering around this building since yesterday." Before she could respond, the elevator dinged. Jun-Lee stepped out, his suit jacket slung over one arm, his tie loosened. The moment he saw Kcee, his jaw tightened. "What the hell is this?" Jun-Lee's voice was low, dangerous. Rose's mind scrambled for the right words. He was just checking her locks, Kcee finished for her, unmoved by Jun-Lee's glare. "You live here?" Jun-Lee asked coldly, his tone laced with a warning. "No," Kcee replied. "But someone has to make sure she's safe when you're busy." The air between them felt like a taut wire, seconds from snapping. Jun-Lee crossed the room, his movements controlled but edged. "If you have a problem, you speak to me. Not sneak into my home like a thief." Kcee's lips curved, but it wasn't amusement. "If you took better care of what's yours, no one would have to." The words hit Rose like a slap, not because of their sharpness but because of the way Jun-Lee flinched, almost imperceptibly. Later, when Kcee left, the silence in the penthouse was suffocating. "You trust him too much," Jun-Lee said, standing by the window again. "And you trust me too little," Rose replied. He turned toward her then, something raw in his eyes, not quite anger, not quite fear. But before he could speak, the city below was split by the sound of sirens. He looked away. And in that quiet moment, Rose knew something was coming for them, and Jun-Lee already felt its shadow. The rain came first. It slid down the glass in silver threads, blurring the city lights until they looked like distant lanterns floating on water. Rose stood barefoot in the living room, her reflection fractured by the window pane. Somewhere deep in her chest, she could feel the pull of something inevitable. Behind her, Jun-Lee was on the phone, his voice low, clipped, urgent. He spoke in Korean, the syllables sharp and fast. She didn't understand the words, but she understood the tone. When he hung up, she asked softly, "Is it about Minhwa?" His eyes flickered toward her, then away. "It's nothing you need to worry about." That was his way, always protecting her with half-truths. But tonight, the air was thick with unspoken things. The knock came at 11:14 p.m. 3 sharp raps. Not a neighbor. Not a friend. Jun-Lee's body went still. He moved toward the door with the same precision she'd seen when he negotiated with cutthroat investors, except this time, there was no performance, only caution. When he opened it, the hallway's dim light spilled in. 2 men stood there. They wore dark coats, their hair slick from the rain. One of them, taller, with a scar down his cheek, spoke first, in Korean. Jun-Lee answered in kind, his voice like steel. The conversation was rapid, tense. The taller man's eyes kept flicking toward Rose, calculating. Then Jun-Lee stepped forward, shutting the door behind him. She waited. Minutes crawled by, each one heavier than the last. She pressed her ear to the door, catching fragments of their voices, words she couldn't understand, but tones she could. Threat. Defiance. Warning. When the door finally opened, Jun-Lee stepped back in, his jaw tight. "You need to stay away from the lobby for the next few days," he said, pulling off his tie. Who were they? Business associates, he said without meeting her eyes. Former ones. It was a lie. She could feel it in her bones. Later that night, when he finally fell asleep beside her, she slipped out of bed and dialed Kcee. "Something's wrong," she whispered. "What happened?" 2 men came to the door. Jun-Lee said they were business associates, but she hesitated. "I think they were here for me." The line went quiet for a moment. "I'll find out," Kcee said at last. His voice carried a weight that made her grip the phone tighter. "And Rose, whatever you do, don't leave that apartment alone." By morning, the rain had stopped, but the storm had only just begun. The morning light was pale, the kind that struggles to break through clouds. Rose sat at the kitchen island, her hands wrapped around a mug of coffee she had forgotten to drink. The clock ticked softly, each second sharpening her unease. Jun-Lee had left earlier than usual. No breakfast together, no brief touch of his hand on her back as he passed. Only a murmur, "I have a meeting," before the door shut behind him. Her phone buzzed. It was Kcee. "We need to meet. Somewhere public." She typed back quickly. "When?" "Now. The cafe across from your building." "Wear sunglasses." She went, heart pounding. The cafe smelled of roasted beans and warm pastries, but the comfort of it didn't reach her. Kcee was already there, seated at a corner table, his frame blocking the view from the street. He didn't smile. "You were right," he said, his voice low. "Those men weren't here for Jun-Lee's business. They're connected to a man named Park Jin-woo." The name meant nothing to her. "Who is that?" "His ex-wife's cousin," Kcee said flatly. "And a man with ties to some very dangerous circles in Seoul." Rose blinked. "What does that have to do with me?" Kcee's eyes held hers. "Everything. Park Jin-woo lost money, a lot of it, because of a film deal that collapsed here in Lagos. That deal was supposed to be fronted by someone using your name." Her pulse stumbled. "My name? That's impossible." "It's not impossible if someone forged your involvement." The realization hit like cold water. Someone had deliberately tied her to a scam, and now the people who lost money were coming to collect. And suddenly, she saw Jun-Lee's late-night calls differently. His tension. His distance. "Are you saying," she asked slowly, "that Jun-Lee knew?" Kcee didn't answer immediately. I'm saying he's not telling you the whole story. And that's dangerous. They spoke in circles after that, Kcee promising to dig deeper, Rose promising to stay alert. But when she walked back to the apartment, the city felt sharper, like it was watching her. Jun-Lee wasn't home yet. His absence pressed in around her, along with questions that wouldn't stop echoing. Had she been brought into his life for more than just making an ex-wife jealous? Was she a shield, or bait? When Jun-Lee finally returned that night, his tie loose and his hair damp from the misty rain, she wanted to ask him everything. But the words lodged in her throat. Instead, she said, "You're late." He kissed her forehead, lingering a moment too long, as if he could feel the distance growing between them. The rain had deepened by morning, tapping a restless rhythm against the glass. Rose woke to the sound, her body tangled in the sheets but her mind already braced for the conversation she could no longer postpone. Jun-Lee was in the kitchen, sleeves rolled up, pouring coffee. He looked almost ordinary like this, hair mussed, expression soft, and for a heartbeat, she wondered if she could pretend nothing was wrong. But pretending was how people got destroyed. "Jun-Lee," she said, her voice calm but aged, "we need to talk." He didn't look up immediately, but she saw the way his hand tightened slightly on the coffee pot before he set it down. "About what?" She walked closer, her bare feet silent against the cool tiles. "About Park Jin-woo." His eyes flicked to hers, sharp and unreadable. "Where did you hear that name?" "Kcee told me," she said. "He also told me that someone used my name in a fake investment deal. That Jin-woo lost money, and that he's connected to your ex-wife." Jun-Lee's jaw shifted, the smallest movement betraying tension. "And you believe him?" "I believe something's being kept from me. I believe that I deserve to know if I'm in danger." Her voice rose slightly, but not enough to break. He took a slow breath and leaned against the counter, his gaze fixed on her. "Rose, there are things in my world, in my past, that I've tried to keep away from you. Not because I don't trust you, but because I wanted you untouched by it." Her laugh was short, humorless. "Untouched? I've been dragged into it without even knowing. I've been watched, followed." She stopped herself, but the words trembled between them. "Do you even know if I was targeted because of you? Or was this all part of why you married me?" The silence between them was thick. When he finally spoke, his voice was low. "I married you because I thought it would solve a problem. I didn't expect you to matter to me the way you do now." The words should have warmed her, but they carried a shadow, because even now, he wasn't saying she hadn't been used. "Tell me the truth," she said quietly. "All of it." His gaze wavered, and in that moment, she knew he wouldn't. Not yet. Maybe not ever. He stepped closer, his hand almost touching her cheek before falling back to his side. "You have to trust me, Rose." Her heart clenched. "Trust is earned, Jun-Lee. Not ordered." They stood there, the rain whispering against the windows, the air between them taut and breaking. Somewhere in that silence, something fragile cracked. And Rose knew this was only the beginning of the real war. Rose walked briskly, her hood pulled low, the weight of her earlier confrontation with Jun-Lee still heavy in her chest. She wasn't headed home. Not yet. Kcee had sent her an address, a small, nondescript tea house tucked into one of the older districts, where the tourists never wandered. Inside, the air was warm and scented with roasted barley. A woman behind the counter gave her a brief nod before pointing toward a secluded booth at the back. And there he was. Park Jin-woo. He wasn't what she expected. Not some hardened criminal, not a man dripping with menace. Instead, he looked ordinary. Black sweater, simple watch, hair neat but not overly styled. Yet there was something in the way his eyes followed her, calm, precise, calculating. "Rose," he said, his voice smooth. "Thank you for coming." She slid into the booth, keeping her back straight. "I almost didn't. But you did." He smiled faintly. "Which tells me you want answers, and that you're tired of being kept in the dark." Her pulse quickened. "Why use my name in your business deal? Why involve me at all?" Jin-woo leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table. "Because your husband is a man who understands appearances. He married you to provoke his ex-wife. I decided to see how much further his choices could be exploited. Her stomach turned. You wanted to hurt him. So you went after me. No, Jin-Woo corrected softly, I wanted to remind him that his life is not as controlled as he thinks. You were simply at the pressure point. She hated that he was so calm about it, hated that part of what he said rang true. What do you want from me now? She asked. For the first time, Jin-Woo's expression sharpened. I want you to understand that Jun-Lee has enemies who are far more dangerous than me. And that if you stay, you will be used again. Rose stared at him, searching for a lie, and finding only an unsettling sincerity. Outside, the rain began again, soft at first, then insistent. Inside, Park Jin-Woo leaned back and said the one thing that would follow her home and echo in her mind long after she left. You think you're just a wife in his story. But Rose, you're the weapon they're all watching. The sound of rain was still in Rose's ears when she stepped out of the tea house. The streets shimmered under the city lights, but the chill in her bones wasn't from the weather. Jin-Woo's words clung to her, you're the weapon they're all watching. She wanted to dismiss them as manipulation, a ploy to make her doubt Jun-Lee even more. But deep down, a splinter of unease had already taken root. She reached her apartment, shutting the door with a quiet thud, as though making too much noise would disturb the fragile order of her thoughts. The place felt emptier than usual. Jenny's laughter wasn't here to fill the air. Rose pulled off her damp coat, tossing it over the couch, and found herself pacing. Each step felt like a question she didn't know how to answer. Was Jin-Woo warning her, or recruiting her? And why, suddenly, did she feel like there was someone else, someone closer, pulling strings? She went to the window, pulling the curtains back just enough to peer into the street below. A black sedan idled half a block away. Its windows were tinted, but she could sense eyes on her. Her phone vibrated. Kcee, stop looking out your window. And don't panic. Her heart kicked hard. She snatched up the phone. Rose, why? What's going on? Kcee, because you're being watched. And not by Jin-Woo's people. She sank into the couch, gripping the phone so tightly her knuckles ached. Kcee, I think it's someone inside Jun-Lee's circle. Someone feeding information to his rivals. Her stomach dropped. Inside his circle could mean only a handful of people, and she knew most of them. But the thought that one of them was selling them out made her skin prickle. That night, she barely slept. She kept the lights low, the TV on for background noise, and a pillow clutched to her chest. She told herself it was all paranoia, that she was imagining shadows where there were none. But deep in her gut, she knew this was only the beginning. By morning, she would decide, stay silent and hope the storm passed over her, or start digging for the truth, even if it meant unearthing betrayals she wasn't ready to face. Rose sat at the small kitchen table, a steaming mug of tea untouched before her. She'd been awake since before dawn, watching the sky shift from black to blue to grey, each passing minute feeding the coil of tension in her chest. Her phone buzzed. It wasn't Kcee this time. It was Jun-Lee. Jun-Lee, I'm sending a car for you. We need to talk. No explanation. No apology for the clipped tone. Just summons. She arrived at the Lee Enterprises headquarters 40 minutes later, the glass tower looming like a cold sentinel above the city. The lobby was immaculate, as always, but there was something in the air, a stiffness in the security staff, hushed conversations near the elevators. When the door slid open to Jun-Lee's private floor, she found him standing by the window, hands clasped behind his back. He didn't turn when she stepped inside. There's been a leak, he said, voice low. Someone has been passing confidential information about my overseas contracts. And about you. Her pulse kicked. About me? He finally turned, and there was a darkness in his eyes she hadn't seen before. Yes. Locations. Movements. Details that only people in my closest circle could know. He stepped aside, and on his desk lay a series of surveillance photographs. The first was of her leaving the orphanage 2 weeks ago. Another showed her at a film set. The third, the most chilling, was of her and Jun-Lee at the park, unaware of the camera. Her voice trembled. Who took these? Jun-Lee's gaze locked on hers. We traced the contact point. The images were sent from a personal device belonging to, he hesitated, and for a moment she thought he wouldn't say it. Siojene. Rose blinked, the name cutting through her like glass. Your former wife? He nodded once, slowly. She's been feeding information to Jin-Woo. Meeting him in secret. I didn't believe it at first, but he pushed a printed bank statement toward her. Large transfers. Unmarked accounts. Her stomach turned. Why would she? Because, he interrupted quietly, she wants to destroy you before I can care about you. Rose swallowed hard. The pieces began to fit, the strange glances, the sudden appearances, the almost too perfect kindness from Siojene when they first met. It had all been a mask. But beneath her shock was something sharper, a surge of protectiveness. If Siojene had been watching her, she'd also been watching Jun-Lee. And that was a line Rose would never allow anyone to cross. She met Jun-Lee's gaze, her voice low but steady. Then we stopped her. Together. For the first time that morning, a flicker of warmth crossed his features. Together, he echoed. But in the pit of her stomach, Rose knew, stopping Siojene wouldn't just mean facing betrayal. It would mean pulling at threads that could unravel everything they'd both built. Rose adjusted the collar of her long coat, the fabric drawn tight around her as she stepped out of Jun-Lee's black sedan. They had chosen the meeting place carefully, a quiet tea house on the outskirts of Gangnam, the kind where wealthy matrons whispered gossip over porcelain cups. Neutral territory. Somewhere that didn't scream trap, but carried just enough intimacy to corner a person with words. Jun-Lee stood beside her, his jaw taut, his hand hovering close to the small of her back in a protective reflex he probably didn't even realize. She felt the weight of the moment pressing on her chest. Siojene wasn't just his ex-wife, she was the ghost in every hallway of his past, the voice that had shaped his earlier years and the shadow that had dictated the terms of their present. Inside, the tea house smelled of roasted barley and citrus peel. The lighting was soft, golden, but it couldn't soften the electric tension that surged through Rose when she saw Siojene already seated by the window. She looked every inch the polished socialite, silk blouse in a shade of icy cream, diamond studs glinting faintly beneath her sleek bob. Her expression was unreadable, the faintest smile playing at the corner of her lips as her gaze flickered between them. You came together, Siojene said, voice lilting but sharp beneath the veneer. How symbolic. Jun-Lee didn't sit immediately. He stood behind the opposite chair, his eyes locked on hers with the precision of someone who'd rehearsed this moment in his mind. We know, Siojene, he said simply. Her brows arched, feigning ignorance. Know what? That you've been leaking information, he continued. About my business. About Rose. About my daughter. The mention of Jun-Lee drew a tiny, involuntary flinch from Siojene, gone so quickly Rose might have imagined it. I see, Siojene said after a beat, her voice cooling. So this is an interrogation? No, Rose spoke up, her tone low but steady. This is a line. And you've crossed it. Siojene's gaze slid over her like frost. You think you've earned the right to speak to me that way because you're, what? The current Mrs. Lee. You're temporary, my dear. A chapter in a story I started. The words stung, but Rose didn't waver. If your story includes endangering Jun-Lee, then it's not a story worth telling. Siojene's eyes flickered, the faintest break in her composure, but she quickly recovered, leaning back with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. You really don't know the man you married, she said softly, almost with pity. Jun-Lee doesn't love you. He never has. You were a tool. Convenient. And now you're a liability. Rose felt Jun-Lee stiffen beside her, his silence heavy. She didn't need him to defend her in that moment, not because she doubted him, but because Siojene's poison was meant to wound them both. You can leave, Jun-Lee said at last, his voice a blade. Quietly. Or you can keep playing your games and see how quickly I end every protection you still enjoy. Siojene's smile faded, replaced by a flash of something raw and dangerous in her eyes. But she stood, adjusting her blouse with deliberate elegance. This isn't over, she murmured, and with a final glance at Rose, one that promised a deeper war, she swept past them and out into the cold. The quiet that followed was thick and suffocating. Jun-Lee finally turned to Rose, but there was something in his expression she hadn't seen before, a kind of inward bracing, as if he knew this battle had only just begun. Rose, he said, almost an apology in her name. She touched his arm lightly. "We'll handle her. But we do it on our terms." He nodded slowly, but his gaze lingered on the door Siojene had just walked through, as though he could still feel her shadow. The first blow didn't come in the form of a lawsuit or a corporate ambush. It came as a photograph. Rose found it early the next morning, not through the tabloids or TV gossip shows, but slipped under their front door in an unmarked cream envelope. The house was still wrapped in silence, the kind of silence that only exists before a city wakes. Jun-Lee had left early for a board meeting, and Jun-Lee was still tucked beneath her quilt upstairs, breathing softly in dreams. Rose padded barefoot into the hallway, the polished wooden floor cool beneath her soles. She bent, picked up the envelope, and slid a finger under the seal. Inside, a single glossy print. Her breath caught. It was her, Rose, in a dim restaurant corner, seated across from a man she hadn't seen in years. The photograph captured a moment frozen in amber, the man leaning forward, his hand lightly covering hers on the table, his mouth tilted in an almost conspiratorial smile. The date printed in the corner was 3 days ago. Which was impossible. Rose stared at the image, the memory tugging and twisting inside her. She had been at that restaurant, but not with him. She'd been with Kcee, the one whom her mother's brother sent. He'd been in Seoul quietly, on business, and had insisted they meet. They'd spoken for hours about family, about the weight of carrying loyalty like an inheritance and her supposed marriage to Jun-Lee. But the photograph told a different story, the framing deliberate, the shadow swallowing half her expression, the angle suggesting secrecy. A trap. By the time Jun-Lee returned that evening, the photograph had already begun making the rounds in whispers, not on television yet, but in the private group chats of the elite, the kind where reputations were bartered like stocks. He found her in the living room, sitting very still, the photograph lying face down on the coffee table. "Who gave this to you?" His voice was quiet, but that particular quiet of his that held more force than shouting. "It was under the door," Rose said. "No note. Just this." Jun-Lee lifted the photo, studied it for no more than 3 seconds before tossing it back down with a sharp exhale. "Siojene," he muttered. "She's baiting us." Trying to turn suspicion inward. Rose's eyes burned. "Then you believe me?" He didn't answer immediately, not because he doubted her, but because he was calculating, she could see it. Measuring the fallout, the counterattack, the layers of strategy he'd have to weave before this became a scandal. Finally, he crouched before her, his hands on her knees. "I know who you are, Rose. And I know what this is. But the problem is," his eyes lifted to hers. "The problem is the people out there won't care about truth once they have a story they can taste." That night, their home felt different, not unsafe, but infiltrated. And deep in Rose's gut, a knot began to form. She had lived through gossip before, through false stories, through press vouchers digging for a tear or a tremor in her voice. But this was different. This wasn't about her fame. This was about destroying the family she'd built. The next morning, it escalated. Someone, and they didn't need to guess who, had sent the photograph to a top entertainment blog in Nigeria and to a Korean business gossip column. The headlines twisted the knife further. Jun-Lee's actress wife spotted in secret meeting with mystery man. Infidelity rumors cloud Lee conglomerate household. In the midst of the online wildfire, Rose's phone rang, the name on the screen pulling her out of her spiral. Kcee. When she answered, his voice was low and urgent. "They've been following me too," he said. "It's not just you in that photo, I've seen the same car shadowing me since I landed. Whoever's doing this wants you isolated, Rose. I think it's time I stopped staying in the background." Her hand tightened around the phone. "Kcee, what are you planning?" But he didn't answer directly. Instead, his voice took on that protective, almost fierce tone she remembered from childhood. "I told you I'd go to any length for you. Looks like we've reached that length. Do you think Kcee will be able to calm the storm that's about to sink Rose's ship?" Stay tuned. If you like stories like this, don't forget to like, share and subscribe for more interesting K-Folk Hub stories.